The CoinDesk Spotlight is brought to you by Nexo, the place to earn on Bitcoin, Ethereum, and more.
Climate change activists, including Greenpeace and Ripple co-founder Chris Larsen, are launching a campaign to convince the Bitcoin community to change the source code and mining more environmentally friendly. Something tells me this isn't going to go over very well. Joining us now with more is Ben Gagnon, Chief Mining Officer at Bitfarms. Hi, Ben. Thanks for joining us. So, Chris Larsen has been talking for a year, $5 million into this change the code campaign to convince miners to move away from proof of work, which uses a lot of energy to verify transactions in the blockchain. Can you be convinced?
We've heard these claims for many, many years from a lot of different groups on the environmental sides of Bitcoin mining and what Bitcoin mining's impact on the environment is. But, a lot of this is really, really shady science. There's not a whole lot of data that supports this, and it really ignores a lot of examples like Bitfarms, who are very publicly and very transparently mining Bitcoin on huge amounts of hydro and renewable resources in places like Canada, the United States, and Paraguay. So since our inception in 2017, we've mined somewhere around 15,000 Bitcoins with hydroelectricity, and these sorts of claims are completely ignored. I don't think that this is going to go anywhere. It seems like another play by Ripple to promote their own token at the expense of Bitcoin using shoddy science.
So what are the odds of the Bitcoin community signing on to this, and what could possibly go wrong?
I think the odds are zero. Nobody who's a Bitcoin miner is going to want to sign on to a policy like this. Proof of work is one of the most important inventions that mankind's had in the last 100 years. I mean, this is an ability for people to monetize energy anywhere around the world, create jobs and create value in remote, overlooked, and distressed locations. This is something that's not going away, and is very, very important. I think a lot of this comes down to this idea that, what we're doing as Bitcoin miners is simply processing transactions, and that's just one part of what we do. The other part of what we do is we keep everybody's Bitcoins who are not being transacted safe. And, when you have that kind of false equivalency of saying, this is the consumption of electricity for a transaction, you're not getting anything meaningful out of that, because it's not just what Bitcoin mining is doing. We're also keeping everybody's Bitcoins around the world safe every single block.
So, in the United States, at least, science has never been able to end an argument one way or another, right? Because, nobody agrees on anything, it seems. And I guess, so the question is like, your perspective that this sort of environmental damage argument is overblown, like, how do you win that argument, though? Like, how do you convince more people of that? Because it also seems that the more mainstream investors coming into the market, they Google Bitcoin, this is one of the first things that comes up, right? This is still a very, very mainstream perception that, Bitcoin mining is very detrimental to the environment. So, like, how do you win that narrative?
Yeah, well, I think we need to win it with the data, because the data is pretty clear on this. I mean, there's been articles back as far as, I think, 2016 and 2017 that said by 2021, Bitcoin would have already raised global temperatures 2 degrees Celsius. I mean, these are outlandish claims that are provably false. With regards to the claims that Bitcoin consumes as much power as countries, this is a really disingenuous claim, because we're talking about climate change, which is a global problem, and they're comparing it anecdotally to one-off countries. What they don't admit and what they don't recognize is that the amount of electricity consumed by countries around the world is an exponential curve. And so you can easily choose a country far down the list, and it still doesn't represent a huge amount of global power consumption. The only way to directly compare Bitcoin mining and its impact on the global climate change program is in the context of the globe. And when you look at it in the context of the globe, Bitcoin's electricity consumption is somewhere between 0.1% and 0.2% of the world's electricity consumption. A very different image in your mind seeing 10 basis points or 20 basis points as compared to an entire country. And so they do that to paint an image that the electricity consumption is far greater than it actually is. The reality is that it's a very, very insignificant amount, more comparable to something like the amount of electricity consumed by Christmas lights around the globe in a given year. And the reality is that most of the Bitcoin miners are trying to take advantage of wasted or stranded energy. I mean, wasted electricity is the number one consumer of electricity worldwide. It's 170 times greater than the Bitcoin network is right now. And that's what Bitcoin miners are primarily trying to monetize through programs like curtailment, like Bitfarms is using in Quebec, the curtailment programs in Texas, the power demand response programs. All of this is trying to tap into this unutilized and otherwise wasted electricity, which would allow the network to grow 170 times bigger than it is today without any change in global emissions.
Interesting. Well said. Bitfarms also, they're reporting sales of $60 million for the fourth quarter of 2021. That's up 33% from the third quarter and up 426% from the fourth quarter of 2020. Tell us what's behind this exponential growth you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a tremendous year at Bitfarms last year. We more than doubled our hash rate, growing from 965 petahash to just a little over 2 exahash at the end of the year. And really, this is a strategic strategy by Bitfarms to gain a lot of market share prior to the halving that's coming up in 2024. So we signed huge contracts, we developed new infrastructure, and we're continuing to do that. This year, we're scheduled to grow about 4 times bigger than we started the year, ending at around 8 exahash at the end of the year. So massive plans rolling forward. We're developing hydroelectric resources in the United States, in Canada, in South America. We're developing all sorts of new sites, and we've got tremendous growth plans ahead.
So my understanding is that most of your mining is taking place in the US and Canada, right? And you have some other places thrown in as well. So this has been one of the biggest stories of the past year or so, is like this move of mining from Asia to North America. But it has also kind of given rise to some concerns that mining will now actually become centralized in North America. Like North America will take a disproportionate lead. Do you think there's any truth behind that?
Well, Bitcoin miners follow the electricity. And if you look at where electricity is available, the United States is the number one market after China. And it's an exponential curve down the list. And so as a miner, like I said before, we're trying to take advantage of that excess electricity. If we want the low-cost electricity, we don't want to be competing with numerous other sources of demand for it. And so we're seeking out power that generally used to fund or used to power old infrastructure back in the 20th century, and has since been exported abroad to other countries or moved to a different facility somewhere else. So in Canada, we've taken over hockey stick factories and all sorts of industrial plants that were built up in the 60s and 70s and were powered with hydropower, and all these electric dams came in there to facilitate this infrastructure growth and this business growth. But over time, those industries left. This means that there's plenty of ready, available, high-quality infrastructure that Bitcoin miners can take advantage of, and that's what you primarily see happening. But we'll go all over the world. Wherever that electricity is available, is cost-effective to develop, and is predictable in the long term, you should expect to find Bitcoin miners there.
Also, so that Bitfarms mined over 1,000 Bitcoin in the fourth quarter of last year. Also in January, Bitfarms purchased another 1,000 Bitcoin. So what are you doing with all your Bitcoin holdings?
Yeah, it's a good question. What we are at Bitfarms is a pure play Bitcoin mining company. So we provide investors on both NASDAQ and the Toronto Stock Exchange for the Ventures Board pure play Bitcoin mining exposure focused on a growing Bitcoin hash rate and a growing Bitcoin hodl. And by doing that, we're giving investors basically the ability to kind of invest it directly into Bitcoin, but really more of a Bitcoin cash flow. So it's similar to investing in something like a Grayscale ETF, where you have a fixed amount of Bitcoin, but that fixed amount of Bitcoin is growing every single day. We announced yesterday we're mining about 12.5 Bitcoins every day right now. So imagine that fixed amount of Bitcoin, just 12.5 Bitcoins every single day onto the balance sheet. So that should give compounded effects or a leveraged exposure to Bitcoin over time. I think that's a very important thing for investors to have, because as we talked about with decentralization before, there's more than one aspect to decentralization. Obviously, you have the decentralization of the miners themselves physically, but more importantly now, there's also this decentralization of ownership that's happening through public companies and through their public shares, so that the owners of our hash rate are spread around dozens of countries amongst thousands of investors and companies who have invested in our company and invested in those that hash rate and that Bitcoin HODL. So by doing that, we're kind of taking away the risk, and we're taking away the incentive for any of us as a Bitcoin miner to do something malicious. We're all incentivized to grow the company and protect Bitcoin together. And that's what's happening, I think, right now in the United States, especially through the public miners.